With the end of the Airbnb gold rush era of buying properties anywhere and making money hand over fist on Airbnb, many rookie investors are learning this the hard way, that maybe short-term rentals aren't as profitable as chalked up to be on social media. However, there are plenty of properties today, even with high interest rates, that can still be profitable, but they are a dime a dozen. And although many properties look like they're potential winners, there are a ton of hidden surprises that if a rookie investor doesn't do the proper due diligence, they'll lose money on their investment. So let's dive into the top 5 most common ways short-term rental investors lose money. And number 5 is the most common one that 99% of short-term rental investors do. So at number 1, we have overestimating potential revenue of a property. A lot of investors use data tools to help estimate potential revenue, but certain data tools include cleaning fees and taxes and other fees, while others just don't. Sometimes realtors or self-interested parties will choose one data tool over another because the revenue is much higher. However, they choose to ignore that the data might include those fees we just talked about, which can greatly reduce potential cash flow. This is dangerous because those fees have to be paid out regardless if the property profits or not. So you need to understand when using different data tools that they might include or not include certain fees. A typical STR investment or a typical Airbnb property will have about a 15% of its total gross income for cleaning fees. Just a quick rule of thumb. Tools like STR Insights, for example, do not include cleaning fees in their gross revenue, so you don't have to worry about that if you use that tool in your revenue estimation. On the flip side, with revenue estimation, some novice investors rely on someone else's word rather than data. I see this all the time with realtors saying, well, there's a couple of properties in this area that are doing really well, therefore this property that I'm trying to sell you can do about the same as that. The problem with that logic is that that property might not have the same attributes and characteristics as other properties. It might be in a different location or even in a different bedroom count. I've seen that too. Or it could be simply just smaller than the other properties. We can't just assume that because someone told us that it's going to make more money or it will make the same amount of money as those other successful properties, that it's going to do the exact same. We have to use data and we have to be smart about our investment decisions. This directly ties into the last point with overestimating revenue that I see a lot of investors go into very competitive markets and assume on day one that they're going to get the rates and compete with people who've been in that market for many years without a simple learning curve. This is like you deciding you want to go into car racing and day one you go drive Formula One, or you try to hop in a Ferrari and race against other experienced professional drivers who've been racing for many years. How do you think that's going to go? The fact of the matter is you're not going to be able to compete at the same level at first. There will be a learning curve which will impact potential revenue. Remember that the two things make a successful property: buying the right property and then operating it at a high level. You can't expect to be the top property in that market without understanding the pricing and revenue management nuances behind the operations as well. So do your research, do your due diligence on this before entering your market so that you can compete at a high level and you can eventually become the top dog, assuming that you have an awesome property. Now, let's move to the second most common way short-term rental investors lose money on their investments. Okay, so at number 2, a lot of people underestimate overall expenses. Let's take a look at some common underestimated expenses that can absolutely kill deals and make you lose a lot of money. So the first one are insurance costs. So insurance costs across the country are rising, and with short-term rentals, insurance costs are usually higher due to the risk of simply random people staying at your place. Even experienced investors going into a new market think that insurance costs are the same across the board, and they forget to get quotes before the closing table. And then they're absolutely shocked that the insurance is 3 times or even 4 times what they expected it to be. A lot of common vacation rental markets, especially beach markets and even some mountain markets where there's threat of natural disasters like fires, hurricanes, etc., insurance costs can be really, really high. So we have to be careful and understand what those costs are. Now, This doesn't mean that they're bad markets and no one should invest in those types of markets. No, it just understand that insurance rates are high in a lot of these markets and will continue to increase, especially with the threat of natural disasters increasing over time. Another expense investors tend to underestimate are tax reassessments. Just because the property is currently paying X amount in taxes doesn't mean you're going to pay that same amount after closing. Remember, there's a reassessment. You need to speak to the county and understand what your property tax could be. We recently found a property in Michigan that was really interesting, and it was listed at about $600,000. But we called the county and we asked what the tax reassessment was going to be, and it was going to go from $7,000 a year in property taxes to $22,000 a year. That's a lot. So be careful and understand your tax reassessment during your due diligence period, because you might find that it actually kills the deal. Also, another expense I don't want you to sleep on is the routine property maintenance. A lot of people don't understand that properties can and will deteriorate over time, and things like the roof, hot water tanks, HVAC, along with other things in the house need maintenance, especially if it's not a new construction. And even with new builds, I've seen some things need maintenance or updating because they weren't built correctly, and the buyer was left to take care of the issue themselves. And so it's good practice to budget at least 3 to 5% of our gross annual income for expenses and maintenance, and this is just another term we call capital expenditures. Now, the final expense I want you to keep on the back of your mind that people underestimate are just the monthly mortgage payments. You need to understand what the current interest rates are as soon as you go under contract. Don't just rely on what you were pre-approved for back a few months ago. A final note on this one, know what your payments will be, and if you have to pay private mortgage insurance, in other words PMI, if you had a down payment of less than 20%. Now, coming in at number 3, this is the third way investors lose a ton of money when investing in short-term rentals, is they buy cookie cutter properties. You know, those one properties in the STR neighborhoods or condo hotels where all the properties have a similar floor plan and they share the same amenities and they all look relatively the same. Maybe the shingle color is different. This isn't unique, and although it can work for the numbers today, what happens if a newer subdivision gets built next year in a better location? We see this a lot in these markets where they're just building these huge subdivisions. It's also hard to sell your place when you're not unique, especially as a short-term rental. I've noticed that properties that aren't unique and in unique locations have a harder time selling because their revenue dips over time, and they can't just justify the selling price. And so we see massive dips in the value of these properties, which makes them bad investments and people lose money on them all the time. This is typically common in a lot of big popular markets where they're building subdivisions, these short-term rentals. Remember, if they can build a subdivision today, they're going to build another one tomorrow, and it's going to continue on and on and on until it no longer makes sense for the builders, especially in areas where there's lots of available land to build. You have to find properties that have a moat or something that separates them from everyone else. You also need to be prepared to invest into your property with the right proper design and decor and amenities, buying things that are unique in the right location. Okay, so coming in at number 4, investors make this mistake of not understanding local regulations, which can be really costly. I'm seeing a ton of people buying locations where there are deed restrictions, HOA restrictions, or even simple local municipality has strict rules on that involve the septic or occupancy limits. You need to know what the local regulations are before you get beyond your due diligence period, meaning you go under contract, you have a due diligence period, and during this time, you need to call the city, the county, the HOA, whatever it is, and make sure you can legally short-term rent that property. One of the scariest things that can happen is you close on a property and you find out afterwards you can't short-term rent that property. Never close on a property without getting a permit or written guarantee that it can be short-term rented. And yes, you can ask for a permit or a written guarantee before you close on a property in most markets when you submit an offer. And if you can't, frankly, you probably shouldn't buy that property. I've had to show up to board meetings and apply for permits and jump through a ton of hoops and get all kinds of inspections before I close on a property so that I could get a short-term rental permit. And if I didn't get the permit, I always had a contingency in my offer that was accepted for a way out. If I can't get the permit, I'm not gonna close on the property. I'm not gonna buy the property. So always, always, always do your due diligence and don't simply rely on someone's word, like your realtor's word, or somebody else that says, yeah, that can be an STR legally. Always verify. And don't be afraid to pick up the phone and make that call to the county, the city, or HOA, whoever, to get clarification if you need it. Okay, at number 5, this is the final one. And this is really the most common one that literally all experienced short-term rental investors, I'd say all, but most experienced short-term rental investors mess up all the time. And this is underestimating the setup and launch period time it takes to get the property ready and going. This is the period between closing the property, launching the property, and then getting booking. One of the biggest things that nobody calculates in are holding costs. I rarely see that in a pro forma or an underwriting tool. So you need to estimate in your holding costs during that period of time. So like your mortgage payments, your insurance, taxes, utilities, because you still have to pay those. So there's an entire period of time when you're not going to be making any money and the property's just sitting there and you own it and you have to pay those bills. And if you have a big project on hand, like a renovation or an update, that might take you months before you even see a dime in return. So you need to make sure that you have at least 6 months of holding costs as a reserve for a scenario like this. Also, don't forget the time it takes to furnish a property. It can take weeks unless you hire someone, but it's still a lot of time and not easy. Then you also have to create the listing and add in all the technology in your tech stack. I see a lot of investors hire out help for setup, but then they forget they still need to create the listing on Airbnb and VRBO along with all the software connections, which can take some time. And then finally, launching the property, there is a ramp up period for every property you launch. Yes, you can launch at day 1 and take bookings, but those are going to be in the future. They might be 3 months from now or 6 months from now. They're not necessarily going to be for tomorrow. So there's a ramp up period where the first few months of a property that's launched isn't going to be booked up like it will in the future. It needs to ramp up and get reviews. And so if you launch in a dead period or a slow season for a short-term rental, it's going to be extremely difficult and you're not going to make as much money as you had hoped in your first few months because it's a new listing. It has to build credibility in the algorithm. So don't underestimate the initial setup period and launching period in that ramping up time. Okay, so those are the main 5 ways, but I know there are many other ways I see investors lose money on Airbnbs that weren't referenced here. But with proper underwriting tools, like the free one I'm gonna post in the description below, and good data, you can minimize the risk of losing money on an Airbnb investment. At the end of the day, don't let anyone strong arm you into a property if you aren't comfortable with it. Be sure to do your own due diligence and never be afraid to pick up the phone and make calls to the right sources if you don't understand something. Now, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and then send it to a friend you know who's planning on buying a short-term rental anytime soon. I will see you on the next one.